We okay to go yet, Sophie?
Yeah, all live.
Okay. Ready to go, Ryan.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be chairing today as Mark Woods, our chair of school forum, is unavailable to attend today. So I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the council website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I would ask all members of the forum who have video cameras to keep their video cameras switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphone muted, except when I am inviting you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make comment should indicate this by clicking the raise hand function on the right-hand side of their screen. When the chair invites you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then mute again to allow the officer to respond. I would ask for your patience if we run into any technical problems, and should this occur, the chair will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed, and the public broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned until such time as it can be reconvened. Before I hand over to Tamar regarding the absences from Democratic Services, I'd just like to welcome Councillor Edna Murphy, who I believe is joining us today as the new chair of the Children and Young People's Committee. So, would the Democratic Services officer please report any apologies for absence?
Apologies received from Mark Woods, Mark Vickers, Yolanda Botham, Karen Taylor and Adrian Ball.
Okay, thank you. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests or non-statutory disclosable interests at this time? I don't see anyone wishing to do so. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. When we reach the item, in the Democratic Services Officer will remove anyone who needed to, so we don't need to do that at this point. So we're going to move on to looking at the minutes of the last meeting. If you want to raise any concerns in relation to the minutes, please do so. Does anyone have any comments in relation to the minutes from the last meeting that need addressing? Please raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing no comments in relation to the meetings, so we can agree these meetings as a correct record of our previous meeting. And the completed action log is included with the minutes for noting. Okay, so moving on to the substantive items of today's meeting, can I please ask Martin Wade to introduce his report, and then there'll be an opportunity for forum members to ask any questions or make comments following Martin's report, and please do so by raising your hand. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so this is the annual report that we bring to Schools Forum on the maintained school balances and the overall position on the dedicated schools grant to the end of the previous financial year. Members of Forum who were at the previous meeting will know that we did bring a report similar to this in terms of the forecast position for maintained schools. And I suppose really that the first point is really, although the balances on table 2.1 do show a significant reduction reduction compared to the previous year. They're nowhere near the original forecast that some primary schools were predicting earlier in the year in terms of the overall reduction in funding. So although we have seen a use of balances within a number of schools and a number of schools in deficit, which we'll come on to, the scale of that reduction wasn't as great as previously forecast. So in reality, that net reduction is now 2.48 million across all the sectors, as you can see in that table. But there obviously are some significant reductions and use of balances by individual schools. And as we go on, we can see there's 37 maintained schools out of the 121 ended the year with a revenue deficit. And obviously in the Appendix A at the end of the report, it does give the detailed school level balance information. You can see there's quite a range of balances and use of reserves over the previous year within those schools there. Tables in 2.4 and 2.5 just give a summary of those kind of the detail of those figures and the number of schools in the different categories and size of balances within those, and obviously the movement between the different financial years in terms of that. Obviously, the biggest concern is obviously the number of schools in deficit, and as I say, that's increased to 37 at the end of the last financial year compared to 31 at the end of 23-24. At the moment, we're obviously still collating the budget submissions from schools for the 25-26 financial year. As at yesterday, we'd had 69 maintained schools that submitted their budgets. 57 of those 69 were showing a use of reserves in year, which is unsurprising given the conversations we previously had at finance about the increasing costs, especially around staffing, which haven't been met by increases in funding from year to year. Of those 69 schools which have submitted their budgets so far as well, 11 of them are showing a cumulative deficit at the end of the year. So obviously we're going to be doing some further work around that to assess the kind of the validity of those budget submissions. For those schools that haven't submitted yet, the deadline for maintained schools is the end of this week, after which obviously we'll be doing a lot more detailed analysis on those budgets. I suspect what we'll probably find is that of the remaining schools to submit, quite a lot of those are ones who are likely to be in a deficit position and therefore are working on initial deficit recovery plans to form part of their submissions. So once we've got that information from schools, we'll obviously be analysing it, and obviously we have the first meeting of our school deficit monitoring group, which is an officer group, which is taking place next week, with Sarah chairing it, and myself and other colleagues attending, where we'll be reviewing the kind of the balance position of schools and the budget submissions from those maintained schools we've received, with a view to obviously then kind of agreeing the level of intervention that each of those individual schools will require, whether it be via a finance support group or a finance improvement group, which will be scheduled for the summer term. And again, we'll bring back further information to schools forum on the kind of the process and how that's going to the schools in those kind of different intervention strands as we move forward through the process. In terms of that. Moving on to schools' financial value standards. I think at the time we wrote the report, we said 116 of the 121 maintained schools had completed and submitted their schools' financial value statement. I'm pleased to say that all maintained schools have now submitted that, and we've been able to submit our assurance statement back to the Department for Education to say that all schools have submitted it for the previous financial year. Just a plea, and I say this every year, but just a reminder to schools really that actually the SFVS can be completed at any time during the year. It doesn't have to be right up until the deadline at the end of the year. So just for schools and governors, just to remind you of that, it might be easier to do it kind of earlier in the year before you kind of get into the close down processes and budget setting processes, which obviously take up a lot of your time. Academy balances, as we noted at the previous meeting, the way in which the DfE now report academy balances in terms of the data sources has changed. The data is only available up to 23, 24, and now the individual school level information is only available via their new financial benchmarking and insights tool website. So kind of did agree with Mark and Ryan at the pre-meet earlier this week, which we might consider producing a very short questionnaire for academies and academy trusts, just to try and gauge the kind of position of academy balances to help with our future lobbying and proposed meetings with MPs, which we're looking at doing in the future, just to try and raise the profile of the school's funding position in Cambridgeshire and the challenges which obviously all of you are facing. So I'll be happy to take any comments on that from academy colleagues, but it's obviously something would be useful, we think, to kind of collate that information for all schools across Cambridgeshire, whether they are maintained or academies. So final section for me is in terms of the overall dedicated schools grant position. And obviously, again, we've had many conversations about the increasing pressures on the high needs block and the overall pressures that this is then placing on the dedicated schools grant in totality. To the end of the 24-25 financial year, the overall net position on the DSG was an overspend of 22.8 million. Majority of that was obviously high needs block. In fact, the high needs block overspent by closer to 28 million, and that was offset by underspends in some of the other funding blocks. Some of those were planned underspends that we'd already put in place to try and mitigate some of the overspends within high needs. But obviously what that does mean is that we now have a cumulative deficit on the DSG of in excess of 62.8 million pounds as we move into the 25-26 financial year in terms of that. Obviously, as we've discussed many times, there is a statutory override in place which allows the LAs to effectively keep the DFG deficit off our council's balance sheet. However, that is currently due to not be extended beyond March 2026, which would obviously result in significant financial risk for the council. And again, as we've said many times, we are not alone in this, and it is a particular concern of a number of local authorities in terms of that if that statutory override is not extended beyond the current timescales. Also, again, as we've discussed a number of times, obviously we're part of the safety valve intervention program with the DfE at the moment. We have recently resubmitted some slightly updated forecasts and numbers based on these year-end positions and forecasts for the next few years. As yet, we've not had any feedback from the DfE on that submission, and we're actually waiting to hear essentially what the future requirements are linked to the safety valve program as we go forward. And again, as soon as we have any more information on that, we will obviously feed back to this group and obviously the wider Children and Young People's Committee as well on the implications of anything that comes back from the DfE on there. So I will pause there. As I say, there's obviously quite a lot of information and quite a lot of impacts, and for individual schools within that. So I'm pause, happy to take any comments or questions at this stage.
Martin, just a quick one from me, and then John has his hand up. So just to confirm, you've had 69 schools respond out the 121 to date.
That's correct.
And so of those, 11 are saying they're predicting a deficit within their budget, and for the previous year, 36 of the 121.
Yeah, 37. Yeah, so 37 of the 121 were in deficit at the end of 24-25. Of the 69 that have submitted their budgets so far, 57 of them are saying they're actually going to be using reserves in year to set a balanced budget. And 11 of those 69 are showing that actually they will end the year with a cumulative deficit at year end. As I say, however, I would expect that number proportionally to increase, because I expect that those that haven't responded yet are potentially those who are kind of finding it harder to balance in year, and therefore more likely to be those ones in deficit.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. John and then Helen.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Martin, for the really helpful paper. Just some quick points, really. Just to support the view of Mark and Ryan in terms of sharing academy reserves and academy financial health, but generally in support of that. I suppose you may have done this modelling, you may not have done. It's obviously just something to put on the radar, isn't it? Really, obviously, there's lots of conversation at the moment about possibly an increased teacher pay award. At the moment, that is just a leak, and there's obviously no confirmation of that whatsoever. But obviously, unless that is fully funded, that will send these budgets of all schools, regardless of the sector, in completely the wrong direction still further. And we are in a situation where it is ridiculously late now in terms of that information being released. I'm not expecting an answer to that, Martin, but as this is a public forum, I think we just need to collectively express our view that this delay on the part of the DfE is completely unacceptable.
Yeah, no, I completely recognise that, and you're right. And obviously, as we know previously, where there have been teachers' pay grants, or and even the grant for national insurance uplift this year, there's a question whether it even does cover full costs anyway in terms of that. So yeah, you're right. The announcement around the pay award and whether there'll be any funding to support that is going to be key to the sustainability of a number of schools, regardless of sector and status. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John. Martin, Helen, and then we have Mary next.
Thank you. This is a point of information really from the unions. We support members with redundancy and restructure periodically throughout a year. There's usually not many, but this year has been catastrophic for it, both in local authority schools, but predominantly academy schools. We're seeing academies some of them having to do redundancy and restructure for the first time. So I think it's really important that that information is quite widely known. What is concerning for unions is it's good that we are involved in redundancy and restructure. Best practice would be that you notify us ahead of time. You don't have to consult if you're restructuring or making less than 20 people redundant, but best practice would say, please get in contact with us, then we can support members and also support schools to do it in a smoother way as possible. There have been a few instances where we've suddenly been alerted by people facing redundancy but haven't known about that it was on the horizon. We've also been invited as unions to input into what skills matrices could look like as part of the redundancy process. So there is concern that perhaps some schools or employers are not aware of how to do redundancy and restructure in the best way. So I just offer that as a please let us know if that's on the horizon, but just we've never known anything like it. There is so much more redundancy and restructure at the moment. Thank you. Thank
you, Helen. And I think it's important to, in these challenging times, collaboration between unions and school leaders is always the best way forward to support members and employees. And I'd encourage all colleagues to take note of Helen's comments there. Thank you. Mary.
I think Martin can guess what I'm going to say. I'm obviously going to say that without the adjustment to the banding model for special schools are almost bound to be in that setting a deficit model. I know we're getting there. We've focused on that aspect of the continuum at this point, although we have now done some work on the medical needs end of the continuum, which was really helpful. Thank you, Martin and Sarah, for that work. But it is that bit of, until we know, we don't know how bad it is. So there's still too many unknowns in our special school world.
Yeah, I completely recognise that, Mary, and just to say it's a piece of work that we are we've had all of the moderated pupil data back now from all of the special schools. So I think I said to you previously we had a couple which was still outstanding. We've had all of those back now. So I've got it in my diary to do some modelling on that tomorrow, and then we've got an internal meeting on Tuesday, after which hopefully we'll be in a position probably just to share with yourself and Charlotte in the first instance, because obviously you've been heavily involved with the work prior to coming come into special heads on the 17th of June. As I have said many times, though, just a kind of the warning on that, obviously, we are limited by overall resources. So the uplift in funding is probably, as I've said many times, is probably not, no one's going to be happy in terms of it's probably not going to be enough from the aspirational amount special heads would like to see, but equally it's probably going to slightly increase our deficit as well centrally because of the transition funding that we're going to have to put in place. But yeah, hopefully we're getting closer to something we can share on that, Mary.
Great, thank you, Martin. As soon as we've done that work, the next step for that then will be the primary banding and onto the mainstream secondary banding, which we didn't want to start until we'd kind of got the sort of top end of the scale in place. So I appreciate the work. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And
that will link into the discussion around the high needs working group that's to come later on the agenda, that Mary's leading on that piece of work. Thank you in advance for that. Any other questions or comments at this stage from colleagues? Okay. Thank you. Oh, no, Nikki, sorry.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. I was just going to ask about the safety valve. I know I've raised it before, but other local authorities, I'm aware the safety valve reports are published and go to Schools Forum. And just wondered if there is a reason why members of School Forum don't get to see the report. We just get, obviously, Martin's summary.
If I'm honest, Nikki, it's because there haven't been any reports, because we are still waiting to hear from the DfE about what the reporting requirements are. So we resubmitted our information back in October, and we got very little feedback in terms of, well, I don't think actually we got any feedback other than some very informal conversations on that. We then received a letter in, I think it was February, to say we were requested to submit information back by the end of March, in which we did. And as yet, we've not been had anything back from the DfE to tell us what the ongoing reporting requirements are going to be and whether they accept our revised plans. So it's not that we are not sharing anything with you, it's just that there isn't really anything to share at this point. I don't know if Sarah wants to add anything more to that in terms of the process.
I think you've said it really, Martin. We haven't had, other than that letter where they've asked, do you want to amend your submission? We haven't had anything back. So, Nikki, there isn't any reporting that you're not seeing. We just haven't had confirmation of what they're expecting to see.
Nikki, do you have any further comment in relation to that, or?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Martin. John, sorry.
Sorry, Ryan, it's just a quick question back to Martin. You mentioned about the situation regarding the statutory override. Is there any indication at all from the government when they'll make a decision on that? We're now obviously less than 12 months really before obviously that comes to an end.
Yeah,
is there not even a timeline?
I've not seen anything personally. I mean, I know the LGA are obviously very involved in those conversations with the DfE and the government around that, as are, I think, SIPFA colleagues from a financial reporting perspective. So I know it's very high on the agenda, but I've not seen a timeline as yet. I'll see what I can find out. But yeah, I think, you know, Michael Hudson, our Section 151 officer, is extremely nervous, as you would expect, about it in terms of that, as are a number of others in his position. But yeah, I'm not aware of anything personally in terms of any agreed timelines, but I'll see what I can find out.
Thank you, Martin.
Sasha.
Hi, it was just a question for Martin. Just wondering how aware you are of the impact of the delays for high needs block funding for maintained schools and for academy schools as well. I know that we've got a number of children that we've been waiting in excess of a year for top-up funding, and meanwhile we're funding children's support that is necessary for them to stay in school. And I wondered whether you're aware of what impact that has on schools' budgets.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we're hearing quite a lot in terms of the impact from individual schools. And I think as we kind of look at the budget setting from schools, the kind of the high needs element is in a lot of instances is what is really pushing schools in terms of the kind of the deficit position there. I know Sarah and team have been doing a lot of work around looking at the resources across the kind of the statutory services to try and improve that the kind of the assessment process and to try and address those delays in the system in terms of that. But there definitely is a recognition, Sasha, that it is impacting on schools and obviously on the individual young people as well. So yeah, it's something we are aware of, and again, it's something that we'll try to be addressed through a number of the work streams which are happening at the moment.
Sasha, could I just clarify your question? Is your question relating to assessment and allocation of funding, or is it relating to the distribution of funding? I'm assuming it's the former.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think both the assessment process is taking longer than statutory, as we know. There's only a small proportion of processes going through at the statutory timescale. But also, I think, yeah, you're right, the impact on families and children as well. But it is, we're now having to fund children support in school to keep them in school, and it's a toss-up whether we can actually manage to do that on the budgets that we've got, and that's an awful position to be in.
Thanks for clarifying. Sarah.
Yeah, I was just going to say we will touch on that, Sasha, in the update around the Inclusion for All work strands, because obviously what's massively compromising that is our gaps in terms of educational psychologists and caseworkers. So I can give an update on where we are in addressing some of those gaps in that item. Because that's basically, we haven't got capacity to manage all the assessments, so that's what's contributing to the backlog.
Thank you.
Okay. Martin, is there anything further for you to add from your report or any further comments?
No, nothing. I think I would say we'll look at kind of putting together a template to send around to academies after half term, just to collect that information from them. And then obviously, as we collate the rest of the budget submissions, we'll provide some further information at future meetings to keep forum updated on the position across maintained schools. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to item 4. And I just need to amend my notes slightly here because I'm not going to ask myself to do that. But I will provide an update as Vice Chair and the Chair of the High Needs Working Group alongside Sarah on the work that's gone on to date with regards to the High Needs Working Group, which has been set up to look at the funding deficit and how we can work collaboratively with the local authority to make recommendations on how we move forward from September 2025. So the High Needs Monitoring Working Group met on the 4th of April, and in that meeting we outlined why the group had been set up, which was for system leaders to work alongside the local authority to develop proposals and recommendations to address the high needs block overspend moving forward in 2025, 26 and beyond. And within that group, we have created 3 task and finish groups to carry out activities that will enable us to provide some recommendations to the local authority around the high needs group. And these will be fed back to Schools Forum in the final meeting of the year in July, with the local authority then taking those away and colleagues reviewing those and making decisions around implementation. So there are 3 strands, 3 task and finish groups. The first is the BAPE review group that is being chaired by Christopher Bennett to look at the amount of funding that is devolved to secondary schools within Cambridgeshire to support attendance and inclusion across the piece and manage permanent exclusions. And That group is comprised of members of Schools Forum and the current BAPE leads. So those colleagues are meeting with Christopher to look at how we can retain possibly some of the benefits and strengths of the model whilst addressing some of the concerns. Christopher, I was just wondering if there's anything you would like to add in relation to that group and the work that you're doing at this stage.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. The group have met twice already, and we're looking forward to meeting again. And where we've got to, we seem to have a way forward as a group, but would like to include, talking to you, Ryan, as being potentially a representative Olive, is to be including Olive within that discussion for our third and final meeting.
Okay, it sounds like you've made some progress, so obviously we can...
Potentially so, but what we are trying to do is to take a more rounded view, because we know no matter what decision, what we decide as being our suggested way forward is going to have an impact, because it's to do with money and how the money flows. And therefore, when we make our recommendation, we would like all parties, all stakeholders, to be aware of what our recommendation would be, and therefore what the consequences would be.
Okay. Well, we've got the final meeting of the High Needs Working Group is on the 27th of June. So I'll wait in anticipation for a communication from yourself about the next steps for that.
Right. Thank you very much, Ryan.
Okay. The second strand of the group, and we've alluded to this already, is around SEND placement and funding. And this links into the work that Mary and others have done alongside local authority colleagues to create a banding model for special schools. And as Mary alluded to, then kind of extending that throughout the system. Mary, is there anything that you would like to add by way of an update there on where the group are at?
Just to make members of Forum aware that there has been a change of the LA link officer from Ross to Michael, who is the new AD for SEND. He's been identified. We've been in touch with each other this morning. He only started, I think, yesterday, so we'll give him a chance to at least tuck his feet under the table, but not much of a chance. Hopefully meeting him on the Monday or Tuesday after half term. As I said, we have already had a meeting regarding the medical needs model, and there will be a paper that's being written by Nadine and I to be shared back with the LA, and then will be shared with Forum, which identifies how that model will work and their place in that continuum, which then just leaves us the mainstream primary and secondary, which we now have got the original documentation on, and I've created some documentation for the continuum. So that's my next job, is to arrange the mainstream meeting. At this stage, I've left the ERBs out of it until they've done their bit of work, because otherwise I'm going to undermine their work before they've done anything, and that's not okay. So we'll let them do theirs, and then we'll add that as the last aspect of the continuum. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. And then the final task and finish group is being led by Peter Law. I'm not sure if Peter is with us today. I couldn't see him across the top. So in regards to the ERBs, I will give a quick update. So there are two strands of activity. So there's already a significant piece of work being undertaken by a number of LA colleagues to develop the rollout of ERB provision in our primary sectors, and that is ongoing. The second element of the work that Peter and his group are doing are looking at reviewing and trying to get further clarity around the funding and the provision that is in the existing ERBs across the primary, secondary and post-16 provision in Cambridgeshire. So two strands to that work, reviewing and aligning what already exists and providing greater clarity around that in terms of funding and expected provision, and then the rollout of the new ERBs into the primary sector, which is well underway. And I don't know, Sarah, if you want to say anything further about the rollout of the ERBs into our primaries across Cambridgeshire at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, I can pick it up in the
Great.
Inclusion for All update, actually, Ryan. But if I could just make one point in terms of this, in terms of the high needs block subgroup, I do think following the financial update that Martin's given us, obviously the most challenging aspect of this work is that we're working within a refined budget of 112 million. So rightly, we need to consider how that budget is being applied equitably, but the budget is not expanding. So as Mary describes it, it's a continuum, isn't it? So we're looking at the mainstream, special schools, BAPE, and then how we reduce dependency on that high cost independent provision by enabling more children to stay in their local communities. But in doing those individual strands, in the paper, there is a timeline that that you ran through at the start, Ryan. And I guess when the recommendations come back to Forum, obviously we will have to look at those recommendations against that budget envelope. And it's where, if the pressures are growing in the BAPE work strand, and that is then saying there is a need for additional funding, obviously the funding overall as a consequence reduces. So I think that's going to be the challenging discussion for Forum. How do we ensure that through this piece of work, the recommendations we're making are affordable within that budget envelope, and we'll have to arrive at what's our prioritisation within that. And I think that's probably going to be the most challenging aspect of this work, because every strand, I'm fully confident, is going to have a strong rationale to say the funding's insufficient. So I just wanted to make that point, because obviously, as Martin said, we're 23 million in deficit and a cumulative of 63 million. So it's not an insignificant issue that we've got to overcome.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think I would make the point probably that the premise of the group is to make recommendations in those three areas. And I think it will then be for you and colleagues to go away and weigh them, I guess, and prioritise, because as you said, when just because we're going to make three sets of recommendations, that doesn't mean that there are three sets of additional funding. The funding is the funding. And that is going to be the challenge, I think, for you and colleagues to then come back to Forum and outline what it is you've decided to do and the rationale, and for us then to discuss.
Yep, absolutely.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah, something to look forward to, but it'll have to be equitable, won't it? So we look forward to those recommendations, and then we'll review them, like you say, come back to Forum and present the rationale for what we're then supporting.
Okay. And so just in terms of a timeline, the High Needs Working Group will meet on the 27th of June, where the three chairs of those groups will come back with their provisional recommendations. They will be discussed, reviewed, refined as needed, and then be presented to Schools Forum on July the 11th for local authority colleagues under Sarah to take away and work on and come back to Forum in due course. I would imagine in autumn. I think we'd said in autumn of 2025, didn't we, Sarah?
That's right. Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions in relation to item 4, which is the High Needs Working Group? Okay, thank you. So that leads us on to item 5. So I'd like to ask Sarah, and not sure if Matt is supporting you with this today, Sarah, if it's just yourself.
No, I'll just go through it. Thanks.
Okay,
Ryan.
which is the Inclusion for All update.
Thank you very much. So you've got a paper that summarises Inclusion for All, and then there is a presentation. I'm not proposing to go through all of that, because you've heard a lot of what Inclusion for All is aiming to achieve previously. What I do need to pick up on is probably the progress against those priority strands. And picking up on Sasha's challenge earlier, if I go to the inclusive people strand, this is where we are looking at the capacity within the service to manage current demand. What we know is we haven't got sufficient demand currently, and that's adding to that backlog of assessments, and obviously that's impacting on school budgets. So what we're aiming to do through this strand is we've mapped what the current demand is. We know that the full-time equivalent of educational psychologists that we require to meet the current demand is 38. At the moment in our establishment, we have 17, but we're carrying a number of vacancies. So we have come up with a proposal to enable us to recruit to 38 full-time equivalent. We know because there's a national shortage that even if we were to get agreement to that, we wouldn't be able to recruit overnight to 38 EPs. So what we're proposing is that we will have the budget for 38 full-time equivalent posts, but we will use the budget equivalent of 18 as a commissioning pot to address that backlog of assessments. So where we are in the process of having that agreed is there is within the council a targeted operating group, which is where you have to go with all your restructures. The proposal's gone there. We had some feedback and we will then be resubmitting it, and then it will progress to our change board, which is the board that our chief exec chairs. And so we will be looking to hopefully a decision by the beginning of June on that current proposal. It is quite an onerous process, but it's onerous deliberately because of the financial situation that Martin's articulated at the start of the meeting. We have to have strong and robust governance around all decision making regarding funding currently. So we have to be making a strong argument that this will improve our position. So that's the inclusive people strand. Within that also, we know we haven't got sufficient caseworkers. So our caseworkers are carrying very high caseloads at the moment, typically around 500, which is comparatively across the region, it's more around 200. So again, we've made a proposal that will significantly increase our capacity for caseworkers, and that's on the same timeline. The other prioritisation, and we've alluded to this in the high needs block task and finish group, is the rollout of the enhanced resource provision, the ERBs. We've currently got 4 ERBs. The intention is that we will move to have 10 by September 26. At the moment, the current ones are 3 SEMH and 1 ASD. So the risk attached to the rollout of the ERBs from a financial perspective, again, obviously this being our financial forum, we need to have tight governance around who attends those ERBs, because there is a risk that we develop ERBs and then we're still paying for our provision for high cost independent provision. And so instead of reducing that expenditure, we actually increase it. So the work that we're doing, that Matt's leading on with Alison Kramer as part of the Inclusive Places work strand, is about looking at the reintegration of children that attend the ERBs. So the current proposal is that children will be at an ERB for 4 terms. I think we might have to be tighter in terms of our ambitions around reintegration. And we're obviously going to have to be very robust in terms of the profile and the decision making around which children attend. So that's the piece of work in terms of inclusive places. And then obviously our other critical area is inclusive practice. So you'll know by now that we received our Ofsted outcome on the 13th of May, you'll see within that Ofsted outcome that there is an endorsement of the approach in terms of inclusion for all. It does reflect the national drive towards inclusion, but there is a lot of there are areas of development. They're not areas of development that we weren't expecting, and they actually reflect what we said at the start of the inspection, and they reflect the priorities within inclusion for all. So in terms of inclusive practice, the Ofsted inspection talked about the timeliness, again, that was been mentioned by Sasha earlier, in terms of the 20-week timeline around EHCPs. It's not good enough. We need to improve the quality of our EHCPs. We also need to improve, and our annual reviews. So they will be all absorbed within that inclusive practice strand. The other areas for development within the Ofsted inspection are around our engagement with parents and carers. So we know we've got a really strong parent-carer forum, but we need to ensure that the voices of those families that are seldom heard, so who perhaps are not able to advocate for themselves or are unfamiliar with the parent-carer forum, we need to have stronger mechanisms to engage with those parents and carers. The neurodevelopmental pathway, the timeline attached to that is too long. So we also need to look at how we support children waiting for a medical diagnosis when they're on that pathway. So that is a priority for improvement. And the final one was around our access for children and young people with SEND to activities and support, which is inconsistent. So they did recognise that there was some really positive opportunities for children, but the offer is inconsistent across the county. So they are the 5 areas of development that we will absorb within the current work strands within Inclusion for All. And you'll see within the presentation, there are KPIs attached to those work strands, and the governance is through the Inclusion for All Change Board that is chaired by Martin, and that will feed into our local area inclusion partnership, which is a statutory requirement for the local authority to bring the key stakeholders together, because this is obviously not exclusive to the local authority. It has to be a partnership approach. So we're in the process of revising the terms of reference, that partnership. We will share that. We'll share it through Ryan and Mark as chair and vice chair. We'll share those revised terms of reference so that we have a clear link in terms of governance with Schools Forum, and we've got the right representation on that group. So I'll pause there. Hopefully what the presentation articulates is that the priorities that I've just referred to in the Ofsted inspection are the priorities that are already driving the work in Inclusion for All and within the high needs block subgroup. Critical to that, obviously, for this forum is the financial narrative that underpins that. So we've obviously got to accelerate our improvement, but do it within the budget envelope that we have available to us. So it's about ensuring that that budget is applied in the areas where we need it to be, and that it's applied equitably, and that it supports need and prevents that need from escalating. So I'll pause there for questions, comments. Thank you.
So I think Helena and then John, please.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Sarah. I was just going to ask, in terms of the KPIs that are shared within the paper and the presentation, has there been any more work or thought done on sort of pinning down the numerical details so that we're able to sort of gauge success and value from money from the Invest to Save initiatives that we've got running?
Yeah, so each of the work streams now have a more developed plan, and obviously those KPIs are very high level, aren't they? So we're looking at the milestones towards those KPIs. So I can certainly share the 3 that I've referred to that we've prioritised have more graduated milestones that I can share with you. It's still a work in progress. I think the most critical strand, and Martin and I are working on this, is that financial narrative that underpins it. So it's easier to say, obviously, we want to reduce the numbers of children in high cost independent provision, but so we know at the moment we're spending around 23 million on around 400 places. We need to be applying a target reduction to that 23 million, and then obviously looking at, well, what does that mean in terms of the funding? So it's obviously much more cost effective, because typically a placement can cost up to 250,000 in independent provision, whereas a placement in an ERB is around about 60,000. So what we need to be able to do is do that financial narrative that shows for each of these work strands, what are the target reductions we're placing on the high cost spend, and what's the consequential financial narrative to support the others. That is still, Helena, a bit of a work in progress, because it's dependent on our accuracy of data, which a number of you will know we have struggled with. So we're getting closer to it, and I'm happy to share where we are in terms of those individual project plans. But Martin, I don't know if you wanted to say anything in terms of the financial narrative on that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sarah. I think we're working on the data still. We've got this week we've got access to some additional reports, which I think will be really useful in kind of letting us start to bring that together. And as Sarah says, it's those interdependencies we need to kind of model what the impact of that is. And we know that in some cases it's not going to be a direct correlation, because we're not going to be able to bring young people back in from some of the provision they're in. So it's there's also that kind of overlap and time lag in terms of delivery of some of that. But yeah, it's certainly something we're working at, and hopefully we'll be in a position soon to share something a little bit more detailed with this group and others.
Thank you. I think head teachers would welcome that, the sense of direction of travel and what the ambition is, even if it was, very speculative and draft in its form. And the other point of clarity, if it's okay, Ryan, I just wanted to ask. You mentioned, and this may be my naivety because I haven't been directly involved in the groups, but you mentioned the sort of short-term nature of the provision within the ERBs, I guess in the guise of wanting alternative provision to phase young people back into mainstream. Is that in totality? Because I recognise that some children that are currently accessing high-cost independent provision, that does become more permanent rather than short-term, or is that going to be met differently through the needs of the group's work?
No, it's a good point. Obviously, the complexity of some needs means that we're never going to get to a position where we have no dependency on independent provision. And I think that's understood. This has to be needs-led as well as having an eye on the finances. But what we want to be able to do more effectively is enable more children, where appropriate, to remain within their local community schools. So that's why we're looking at it as a continuum. So obviously the ability for mainstream schools to manage need, parking those that are never going to be able to thrive in a mainstream school, but to enable more children who can thrive in a mainstream school. Part of this continuum needs to be also looking at the funding mechanisms attached to mainstream top-up. So again, going back to the high needs block subgroup, we've got the different work strands, and it's how in that budget, that 112 million budget envelope, if our aspiration is to keep more children in mainstream provision where appropriate, it needs to be loaded, that finances needs to be loaded earlier on in that continuum, doesn't it? But we've got to work out how do we do that whilst meeting current need. As Martin's just described, we can't just withdraw children immediately from that independent provision, even if their needs are such they can be met differently, but they can be aged out. So we can look at a reduction in that way, and we can cease to place as we build up more provision. So it's mapping all of that really. And that's the key piece of work. And I think when Ryan said we're looking forward to those recommendations, I think that will be the bit where actually having reviewed if we want to keep more children in mainstream, the costs associated with that are these. What does that mean in terms of reducing cost elsewhere, and what are the implications of that?
Thank you, Sarah. And I think Martin's point, the challenge about the lag in is the difficult bit, isn't it? Because we have to invest at that bottom end of the continuum, as you said, to reduce the spend at the top end. And those things aren't going to happen simultaneously. The investment and the development of provision will have to come first, with the view that that will, over time, as you said, hopefully reduce at the top end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously brings us back to why it was so positive to get the support for the disapplication of the funding for the schools block, to support some of that.
Okay, John, next, please.
Thank you, Ryan. And I've got two questions, if that's possible. The first one relates to something you said really around, Sarah, about overall governance in the council. And don't get me wrong, I think considering the pressure that the council's actually under, it is quite right there is close scrutiny of all spending decisions, structural change, etc. But I suppose my question here is probably more to Councillor Murphy. Do you believe, as chair of CYPS, that the council's decision-making process is responsive and quick enough, given the scale of the crisis, which Sasha kind of highlighted earlier on, and especially given the fact that going forward into the autumn term, decisions will need to be made, and probably fairly quickly, in order that actually Forum can make a decision about future disapplications? So, yeah, is the governance doing its job, and is it working quick enough?
And you're posing that to Councillor Murphy, I think, did you say, John?
Probably, because I think this is more kind of members and council oversight.
So could I just answer that? I'm first of all, I'm really grateful to attend, and I'm really here to listen and learn, because I was nominated yesterday.
I'll put you on the spot there. Apologies for
that. And we haven't yet had a committee meeting. So I would like to sort of reserve my sort of response on that if I could, and I would like to defer to Sarah, but obviously that is something that I mean, thank you for raising it, and it's certainly been thinking about it and trying to get my head around that as soon as possible.
Yeah, and John, I think, as Councillor Murphy said, very new in post, and we've got meetings scheduled. I'm really looking forward to working with you. And I do think that, I take your point, there is a sense of urgency, obviously, around this, but I think the governance is rightly thorough and actually constructive in terms of ensuring that what we're presenting is financially robust and will definitely improve the experience for children. But we'll look forward to having those meetings. Yeah.
Okay. My second question is very specific, actually. It relates to something in the presentation regarding the case management system, Nexus Impulse, which you obviously set out is inadequate. Just out of interest, how much did it cost to implement that system? And also, what learning have you taken from the fact it has clearly failed?
Thank you, John. Luckily, that did predate me. So I don't know the cost, but Martin may. But what I can say is that we're in the process of implementing the new EYES system. And there is very robust governance around the implementation, and there was a lessons learnt, and within that lessons, and that is obviously shaping the approach to EYES, and within that lessons learnt, there was a clear lack of engagement from the service. So obviously it's like getting a new mobile phone, isn't it? And it's got all that potential, but perhaps you're only able to use it to text. So I think what we've learned is, to be able to use the full functionality of that system, we need the service shaping what fields we need to have. And so we've had full engagement of the service in terms of testing the system and its functionality, but also shaping what it's able to do. So, and we've got very, very tight governance. I am the SRO of that. I have to go to Change Board every month to report on our progress, because there is a very keen need to not make the same mistakes twice. But I don't know, Martin, if you've got the financial information in terms of the level of investment on Casey. I don't know.
I'm afraid I don't know the total cost of the implementation of that. It's certainly something we could find out if we needed to.
Thank you.
John, is that happy to move on?
Yeah, thank you very much to the three colleagues there who replied.
And I think my only comment would be systems are only ever as good as the people and the capacity there are to implement them. So I'm hopeful that the system isn't being seen as a new system, isn't being seen as something that's going to be a silver bullet, if you like, that's going to solve this issue. I think it's much more about the capacity and the leadership and the drive around that. And it sounds like some lessons have been learned. So hopefully that will be beneficial. Leslie?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Just really building on some of the things that have been said, but I just wonder what's the messaging, and I think particularly perhaps I'm looking at primary, where you've got this delay in EHCPs and reviews, etc., and we're finding that unfortunately children are being suspended, and that hasn't happened as much in primary, but because people haven't got trained staff, they haven't got the capacity, that sadly is happening more and more. And is there any way schools can be compensated, you know, when we've got waiting lists and some are up to over 70 weeks, etc. So that's a lot of money and a lot of lag funding that's owed, and we all know, you know, the state of school budgets. But I just think, what is the messaging to schools who are really trying their best with limited capacity, because of some of it, partly lack of the funding and the delay?
Yeah, so in terms of the backlog, so those children that are waiting for assessments, and as you said, some of them are waiting way too long, we have agreed a prioritisation process. So if those children are tier 4 health needs, so complex health needs, or they're looked after children or post-adopted children or open to social care, we are looking at potentially backfunding those cases. We've had to look closely at that prioritisation process because of the significance of the numbers of children who are outside of timescale. Obviously, for us to backfund in a blanket way for all of those children is simply unaffordable. So we've had to look at and manage risk in terms of, for some children, waiting in that backlog is not appropriate, and we have to absolutely prioritise them. So if you have children or your schools have children that are in those categories, then you need to alert us and we will look at those. Obviously, there has to be some level of flexibility within that. So I have been to visit some schools where it's particularly critical and they have articulated and provided evidence about the significance of the impact, and we are looking at them, but we have to have an equitable process. So that's the initial kind of prioritisation, Leslie. So if you want to alert us to those particular cases, we will absolutely review them.
Okay, thank you. I think that's useful to know. Thank you.
Nikki.
Thanks. My first question, I've got two questions. My first one relates to picking up the point that Helena made about the idea of the 4 terms. I think that obviously when we are looking at provision within a financial envelope, there is a very real pressure to deliver what is affordable. And I wonder where the reference point is for the idea of the 4 terms, because is it research based? Is it evidence based? Is this a model that is already operating in other authorities? Because it seems quite an unusual kind of random figure of 4 terms. And I think we've already talked about how being in situations where decisions have been made, you know, under that financial pressure and have then had longer term costs because it hasn't necessarily turned out the way that we would want it to. So really it's about what is the evidence base for this idea that 4 terms and then back into mainstream is my first question.
Yeah, so I don't think it's rigidly set at 4 terms, Nikki. I suppose the point I was making was we need to look at that timescale and have exactly what you're saying, a rationale for why are they, because I suppose what we've got to balance is if children are in an ERB and then thrive in an ERB, but then have to move from an ERB, let's face it, all of them currently are primary, into a very different context at secondary, their ability to thrive in a secondary might be more challenging. So there's something about the model enabling those children to equip themselves with the skills to then be able to, and I know obviously this is all dependent on the significance of need, but the objective of the ERBs was for those children that don't quite need that specialist support, but need some specialist support to enable them to access mainstream provision. So it's about achieving that balance, isn't it? About having the right therapeutic model that enables those children to thrive, but also looking at their longer term journey and not creating a scenario where they're only enabled to thrive within that environment. Because if we do that, we're doing them a disservice, aren't we? Because surely we want them to become, as much as they're able, independent and able to have those life skills that enable them to progress. So I think the point I'm making is there's 2 challenges here. How are we ensuring that the model is right to support children to then be able to access education by adopting the right coping strategies, but also how do we ensure that the model is affordable? And I think I've done that in the right order. It has to start with the needs, doesn't it? But we also have to think we're not creating something where we end up with a number of ERBs for children that actually will never go back to mainstream, when the objective was that we provide short-term intervention that enables them to go back to mainstream.
I think I appreciate what you're saying. I think what head teachers will say is that the very reason that they are getting a place in an ERB is their ability to thrive in a mainstream setting, because often for some of those children, particularly around ASD, for example, it might be that the environmental aspect, triggers certain behaviours. And what I would hate to see is a child sort of going into an ERB, starting to thrive, and then with no research or evidence basis, us just saying, well, you've had your money, back into mainstream, and then they go round in that cycle in the same way that we see children in social care going in and out of levels of support. So I guess it's just being mindful that, yes, we are under financial pressure, but we need to have a good, solid evidence base for the provision that we are or the model that we are suggesting.
And that, just to reassure you on that, Nikki, that is why we've got Dr. Matt Beek, isn't it, as leading on it to ensure that it is underpinned, and he is looking at the research in terms of, because we know nationally that every single local authority is looking at this as a model, but it doesn't work unless it's underpinned by that therapeutic approach. So that's absolutely why we've got Matt leading on this.
Thank you. And then my second question, allowed a second question, was the workforce strategy, about how creative we're being with the workforce strategy in terms of EPs, because obviously this is a national issue, there's a national shortage, but I know that there are other authorities where they are being quite creative with, for example, tiering the EP work so that some of it is done by trainee EPs. I know a lot of the London boroughs are doing this, overseen by a qualified EP, and I just wondered what the sort of the strategy, the people strategy was, because like you say, they're not going to magically appear overnight. So you said you made reference to a commissioning group. What does
Yeah, so yeah, we're looking at different models. Obviously, I've come from a London borough, and that London borough are supporting us in our sector-led improvement, and we're meeting with them on our action planning for Ofsted next Friday. And one of the approaches that we've looked at, I actually met with our independent chair of the Rapid Improvement Board, who oversees the Ofsted plan for social care, yesterday. And what we're doing is, we don't want this to be a deficit model that's looking at, this is a problem we've got to solve. This is a drive for inclusive practice. So all of those job descriptions will be generic job descriptions for inclusion officers who have different skill bases. But those skill bases we expect will shift as we become more inclusive. So my sort of analogy is, we're in the urgent and critical space, but if we only respond in an urgent and critical way, we don't change the practice that stems demand. So this is the approach that we're developing, is very much about, we've got no option but to manage the critical right now, the backlog of assessments that we've all just been talking about, but we want to be in a space where we reduce the numbers that are going into that backlog. And the way that we will reduce the numbers is by working differently, and that is by creating an inclusive workforce. So whereas we have people currently operating in discrete strands, we will look to have an inclusive workforce that's more agile. So for instance, there's a clear parallel with the new expectations around attendance, where there is an expectation that we work in a multi-agency way with children with SEND, because they're overrepresented. So we need to be thinking about how we're creating a workforce for the future that has less dependency on those statutory roles, but right now we need to have sufficient capacity, and that's why I've talked about not just doing what we've always done and recruiting 38 FTE EPs. Actually, let's look at it differently. Let's commission on a case by case the assessments that we currently have, whilst we change our practice and develop this inclusive workforce.
Thank you.
Could I just ask, Sarah, is there not a risk that that may actually cost more money because you're paying consultancy fees, and rather than employing people, I can see the rationale for it, but I'm wondering, it's a bit like when I'm setting a budget for a school, I don't recruit a teacher, so my budget, it looks better for that year, but then I end up having to bring in someone through an agency who I might not have the same level of control over to ensure the high standards are met, and I end up paying more. I'm just asking whether that's kind of being considered and mapped out, because I can see the rationale.
It's been brutally considered, Ryan, because so two things on that. This is the commissioning aspect is a short term to reduce the backlog, and what that enables us to do is reduce that backlog more quickly, because we can obviously we can do it on a case by case, and we can go through our commission providers and say, we've got this many cases backlogged. Instead of onboarding a number of EPs, we can do it more quickly by having more EPs over a short space of time. But what that means is that commissioning pot that we've allocated, which is equivalent to 18 full-time equivalent posts, stays in that structure, but is then used on an implemented phased recruitment process to onboard more in-house EPs. So it's a kind of hybrid that enables us to get over the critical and urgent, whilst then building in-house capacity. But that's just one aspect of the restructure, and it's been rigorously reviewed from a financial perspective, and nothing that was creating additional expenditure would be supported. So it's got to be about using the funding we have available to us in the services that we require it most.
Thank you. And sorry, I will come to me. And I guess, are you confident that you are going to be able to commission sufficient number of EPs to deliver that rapid work to remove the backlog?
Well, we've obviously, as part of our due diligence in arriving at this proposal, we've had conversations with various providers to see, and every local authority at the moment is in this scenario, and every local authority is being bombarded with agencies offering to support them. So we obviously have to do our due diligence, and we have our own procurement processes that we have to operate within. So I suppose the short answer is yes, but obviously this is all dependent on sign off that have obviously gone through in terms of that governance that I've already described.
Okay, thank you. Mary, sorry for the delay.
Hi. So I just wanted to come in really on the bit about ERBs, because there is a complexity that we've kind of uncovered, Nikki, around the labelling of everything as an ERB, because actually we've got two models going on. One of them is a high intervention significant support model with a turnaround, and the other model we have in the local authority is a continuous place. And by calling them ERBs and setting out a documented version of an ERB, we're putting them all in the same bucket and talking about them all in 4 terms, whereas actually it was the intervention strategy stuff that was originally spoken about in 4 terms. So I think we've got a mixed economy of what we're referring to when we say ERB, and that's one of the recommendations that's likely to come out of the strand that I've been working on is, you know, when we label a continuum of provision, is it helpful to put them all in one bucket when they're actually different things, or do we identify them as different types of ERB? Because as you rightly pointed out, a young person with complex autism who can manage in a resource base on a school site, but that will always need that provision, is different from a young person who's got a significant mental health impact that is impacting on their, and therefore they're being identified as SEND, and who needs high impact, high intervention turnaround provision. So I think, Nikki, that will come out of the strand that we're working on, but we're not there yet. But I think we're probably clear that we've got a very mixed economy about what an ERB is. And I will openly say, you can find research on the timescales for any of those that will tell you any number that you want to come up with. So we just need to be mindful that sometimes research is funded research for a particular outcome, and therefore we just need to be careful that we use the skills and huge knowledge base that we've got in the authority, for example, around those medical needs, people and the outstanding provision we've already got, and ensure that we co-produce that with the people who know those young people best. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Mary. That's a really good point, because the secondary ERBs that we have do not fit that model. They are children who come in normally in year 7 and stay for the duration. So I think that comes back to the strand of work that you're doing and that Peter's leaving, about clarity around what it is we're doing, how that's funded, what the expectations are for all stakeholders when engaging with the ERB programs. Okay, any further comments in relation to item 5 and Sarah's inclusion for all update? Okay, so we're moving on now, and I think, Tamar, am I right in thinking we're now just looking at, there is no vote required today?
No.
Forum are asked just to review the contents of the report and reflect on the questions and discussions today.
That's correct.
And then that just leaves us to move on to confirming the schools forum agenda plan. Are there any changes to the plan moving forward?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know, Sarah or Martin, is there anything else that needs to be added?
Not at this stage I'm aware of, Tamar. Thank you.
Okay, so if I ask members to note the agenda plan and that links into the next school forum meeting, which will be on Friday, the 11th of July at 2025. And that brings us to the end of today's agenda, I believe, Tamar. I'd just like to thank everyone for their questions and contribution, and to those LA colleagues and those colleagues from the High Needs Group who have presented today and fielded questions. And if that's all, we will bring the meeting to a close there. Thank you.